Earlier this year, shortly after the airing of Book 1, Owen Dennis's Infinity Train continued with its second book, Cracked Reflection. After thoroughly enjoying the first book, even giving it an 8 out of 10, I have nothing but high hopes for this one. In this episode, just like last time, I'll be going through each episode, giving it a score, talking about the season in general at the end. Also, just in case you were worried, no spoilers beyond this book in the video, but massive spoilers for Book 1 and 2. And without any further ado, every episode of Infinity Train, Book 2, reviewed. Episode 1, The Black Market Car. Mirror Tulip tries to create a new life for herself outside the mirror world. Continuing in the trend from last season, this book starts out exceptionally well. First, the opening scene does a great job in showing how Mirror Tulip got from looking like how we knew her before to how she will look moving forward. The scene immediately following it is fantastic too. The variety of cars, with the only constant being MT, is incredibly cinematic. One thing this season immediately takes advantage of that the last season didn't have was, unlike Tulip, Mirror Tulip can actually fight. The action in this book is an immediate step up from the book prior. I'll talk about MT's character throughout this video, but she is immediately characterized in the first 5 minutes or so the setup portion of this episode is kept to a relative minimum. That's not that they don't set up, however, they set it up in some subtle ways, like Steve telling Mace it's been a few months since the Chrome car, and extremely unsubtle ways, like MT telling a mute deer her life story in a completely uncharacteristic way. Anyway, the flicks aren't very fleshed out here, but that's remedied in future episodes. Alan Dracula is also a weird choice for the third member of the squad. I understand though, as an Atticus or a 1-1 would have gotten in the way of MT and Jesse. Speaking of Jesse, his introduction, while brief, characterizes him quite well. Despite not really knowing the flaw that landed him on the train, you begin to understand his character as a chill dude who just wants to have fun. Also, some of the settings in this episode are fantastic. From the Black Market Car to Alan's home, they're all nice settings for the action of the episode to take place. While it definitely has some problems, like the less than subtle conversation between MT and Alan, this episode is a great season opener. Episode 2, The Family Tree Car. Mirror Tulip and Jesse climb down a real live family tree. Picking up right where the last episode left off, this episode does a great job in setting up the book-long dynamic of MT and Jesse. First, by giving the first hint towards what Jesse's flaw is, well, calling it a hint might be a bit of a stretch.
Well, trying to make everyone happy didn't really work out.
Luckily, the mystery of Jesse's number isn't nearly as important as Tulip's was back in book 1, so it's not that big of a deal. The whole family tree thing is kind of funny bit at first, but with no resolution, it just kind of acts as a background for the episode. The tree grows with bad vibes aspect of the episode was terribly cliche, but luckily they don't dwell on it very long. Saving this episode from being a slightly charming character arc setting up fest with great music is the quality and variety of jokes. From Jesse naming every animal he sees Dracula to him barely being able to hold up MT, the jokes come at you fast throughout this episode, and it helps greatly during the parts where it seems to just drag on. The setting gets a bit boring. MT goes from not wanting to talk to Jesse to being willing to travel with him in one episode, and the entire plot of getting Alan Dracula back didn't even matter. This episode isn't hard to sit through and doesn't negatively impact other episodes, but it is still a step down from the first book and the book 2 season premiere. Episode 3, The Map Car. Mirror Tulip tries to help Jesse get his number down. This episode has almost the exact opposite pros and cons than the last episode. First off, unlike the last episode, Marcel is funny, and the concept of an episode taking place on a map is great. The realization of being able to edit the map wasn't overused, and the ending is satisfying. However, barring Marcel and Alan Dracula just spinning his head the entire time, this episode is very light on jokes. The episode is a little bit further drilling into your head Jesse's problem of trying to please people instead of doing what he wants, but the episode is mostly spent by MT trying to forcibly fix Jesse's number. And yes, the paradox of Jesse needs to learn to not do things to please people, but MT wants him to do that is a bit creative, but they don't delve into it much. Instead, we get to watch MT say the same thing over and over and over again until the episode is finally over. Now, what helps this episode not be a complete dud is the ending. I do have to give this episode props, as it sets up that real water would screw MT over, but managed to do it subtly enough that I didn't see it coming even once the entire world turned into actual things instead of paper. The flex are obviously not fleshed out, especially considering they only get 4 seconds of screen time, but they are starting to become a more prevalent threat than the steward or conductor ever really were. I know I spent a considerable amount of this part talking about the differences between this episode and the last, but one thing that isn't different is their score. Episode 4, The Toad Car. Mirror Tulip and Jesse get stuck in a car and face an unusual dilemma. After 2 less than stellar episodes in the series, this episode really hits it out of the park. First, this episode is one of the funniest of the season. This joke in particular might be my favorite out of either of the first 2 books.
Please don't kick me. Why would we kick you?
There was just something so funny about inserting a talking toad with Elvis-like dialect pleading not to be kicked in an otherwise perfectly tense situation. While having two cops literally play bad cop, good cop is a bit cliche, they really get you to understand why Jesse might be inclined to accept C's offer. This is the first episode where Steve and Mace are really fleshed out at all, and this is also where they become one of the best parts of the book. Unlike Book 1's antagonists, the steward and ultimately the conductor, who were distant and mysterious until episode 8, the Flecks are prevalent and a threat the entire time. Well, yes, the attempt to fit the events leading up to Jesse getting on the train did feel a bit forced. The Nixon scene was heartbreakingly realistic. Even though Jesse didn't get a traditional tape, which I'm admittedly still a little bit bummed about, this is a serviceable replacement. Alan Dracula is again mainly used as a comic relief along with the toad in this episode. I'll talk about it more in my season recap, but I really don't feel like Alan's minimal use in this season really hurt the experience too much. The ending scene with him freeing the toad was nice. Alan kicking the toad was a nice way to have the toad get kicked without having MT or Jesse do it. This episode is easily the best in the season so far, so it really shouldn't be that hard to see the score coming. Episode 5, The Parasite Car. Mir, Tulip, and Jesse gain an unexpected companion. The beginning part of this episode is a very charming and natural conversation between MT and Jesse. The jokes woven in throughout the genuine character development and plot development in this conversation makes it a great episode opener. Once we meet Perry, the episode really picks up. I think this episode uses Alan Dracula perfectly. In a plot revolving around a silent character who mostly acts randomly as a comic relief, you need to have the main point of the episode be the character development of the other characters. The show expertly uses a scenario to not only have a story about whether or not it's worth controlling somebody to do what you want, but to show how MT and Jesse have really started to bond and work really well together. The fashion, or runway car, was nice for jokes too. It really didn't do much more than that, besides giving you furry nightmares, but it was short and not intrusive enough just to move past it. The climax of Perry being forcibly removed from Alan is a pretty good ending. I like the montage of Tulip going back and getting the flower way more than I should, the callback to AD sneezing at the beginning of the episode, and even the use of the setting is great. The episode is pretty good but does falter in a couple of ways. Perry really isn't a great character, he just kind of acts to progress the plot. One thing I'd like to note is that the 5th episode of Book 1 perfectly sets up the second half of the book, while this episode really doesn't. Not a knock on this episode, but it doesn't make it harder for the following episodes. Still a great comedic episode though. Episode 6, The Lucky Cat Car. MT and Jesse enter a carnival car and have to compete for the exit. The great moments between Jesse and MT are really the highlights throughout this episode, starting almost immediately. The characters bounce off each other really well as they play games and try to beat Grace. The show really takes advantage of the two main characters with their flaws and arcs. Speaking of characters, there are cameos galore in this episode, from the Toad being backed, now named Terrace, to a slew of characters in Book 1 returning. The Crystal Guy, Khaki Bottoms, even Nancy from the Straight Up Italy car. These cameos are not intrusive enough that they just end up being nice ways to shortly revisit these characters. The cat, on the other hand, is a central part of the episode. She is back to her cunning ways and is used expertly in this episode. One attention to detail that I noticed is that since MT broke off from Tulip in the Chrome car, she never saw the cat redeem herself. The whole scene with MT freaking out about the train wanting to see her fail was a bit weird and forced. It felt like the writers needed a reason for Jesse to bring up that he planned to take her off the train with him. And while that scene was nice, MT talking about how she was doomed from the start to lose when they are literally 2v1 in Grace is a bit off topic. Also, Alan Dracula being a nuisance to the team is starting to get annoying. Grace's reveal and the Apex coming in to wreck stuff was a great ending for the episode, setting up expertly for the next one. Overall, a pretty good episode that has a few key flaws that hold it back. Episode 7, The Mall Car. Someone mysteriously invites Jesse and Mira Tulip into a mall car. While the Flecks are most certainly the main villains of this book and are great in their own regard, the Apex truly shines as a sympathetic antagonist. Simon's characterization in this episode is kept to a minimal, but Grace, in addition to the last episode, is characterized not as a completely bad guy, but as someone who is just misled. If you take all of Grace's actions that are bad and use her logic of denizens not being real and not capable of feeling, you get a well-intentioned teenager. Just thought I would point out this excellent writing. Back to the actual episode, I think this is Jesse's best episode yet. Seeing Jesse slowly go back to his old ways, as seen by the fluctuation information in his number before finally conquering his problems was great. Definitely less preachy than Tulip's was in the last book. One small criticism I have for this episode is the sudden nerf of both MT and Alan. While Alan Dracula is random enough that he could have just decided not to leave, MT goes from being a pretty good fighter to getting beat up by children. The end of the episode, however, more than makes up for it. After an incredibly upsetting scene of Grace getting Jesse to destroy the Knowles block, which clearly makes him upset, we get the saddest scene in the book. The reveal that MT cannot traverse back to the normal world is done so that you completely forget about the Flex chasing her down. The episode's last moment with MT looking up at the Flex really conveys the feeling of hopelessness that continues into the next episode. Overall, a great episode, one that's emotional, has great music, has a turning point in the book, and leads expertly into the last arc. Episode 8, The Wasteland. Tulip finds herself in the wasteland outside of the train. The first 2 minutes of this episode are fantastic, one of the most creative and fun to watch chase scenes of the show with great action. Even the first few seconds with the feeling of hopelessness for the last episode continuing and Simon and Grace conversing about the fate of Jesse. But despite the great opening of the episode, it's easily the weakest part. The rest of this episode consists of just MT and Mace, with Mace spending his remaining moments tormenting Tulip. At first, he seems completely insane, singing parodies of Christmas songs. But then, most of the episode is a dark monologue from Mace, with interjections from MT about how he's wrong. I cannot overstate the greatness of Mace's writing in this episode. The entire time, he's constantly barraging MT with how stupid she was and how hopeless her life is. The way he makes both MT and the Watcher rethink her entire relationship with Jesse and whether or not she's even her own person is done incredibly well. The whole time, you can feel the speech coming to one point, and the payoff is immaculate.
I'd say you became kind of a reflection.
Yes, and at the end of the day, this is a kid show, so MT has to have her I can do anything moment. A large part of this episode is just completely dark. The exchange might be my favorite part of the entire series up until this point. It's easily the best written. Speaking of this being a kid's show, Mace's death might be the most gory and brutal moment on Cartoon Network in years. Here, take a look. The fact that the equivalent of blood splashes onto MT's face make you question how Cartoon Network let this happen. The cinematography of Mace's hat flying away and MT doing the classic I just killed somebody look into her hands finishes the episode expertly. I really enjoy this episode as the theme of hopelessness and philosophical repercussions of having everyone on the train be created to help better teach the passengers a lesson and what happens after that passenger leaves. Obviously you know the rating, but if I could give it a 6 out of 5, I would consider it. Episode 9, The Tape Car. Tulip hitches a ride to the car where passengers are assigned their numbers. The first half of this episode is fairly weak. MT's stubbornness and somewhat out-of-character anger towards the train documentaries was very distracting considering it came off of one of the darkest moments in the series. I get that she wouldn't be laughing at the tapes or anything, but she still seemingly overreacts. Once getting to the namesake of this episode, the car is incredibly creepy. The reveal of the tapes coming out of the passenger's head gets me every time. The context added that this entire sequence happened to Tulip Prime in the first episode of the series is greatly appreciated. I really appreciate the two characters whose backstory we kind of see, both the girl who kills her lizard and the business guy who gets an incredibly high number. I also hope we get to see more of the guy that MT throws onto the train without a number, although 1-1 might have just taken care of that. Anyway, back to the episode. It really starts picking up once you get to the end. MT not being able to receive a number was fairly easy to see coming, especially considering this was the 9th episode and not the 10th, but her complete breakdown and anger was not. Watching MT go into a fear-induced rage of never getting off the train was great to see. Her entire arc has led to this moment, and seeing it fail, causing her to start to realize that she might be stuck on the train forever, is a great moment for MT and is one of her defining moments from the book. The big reveal of the steward, still with the scar from last season, showing up carrying 1-1 was not expected, but was still a great addition to the episode. Overall, while not a super exciting or deep episode, it's MT's breakdown, the reveal at the end, and the general creepiness of it make it a pretty good penultimate episode. Episode 10, The Number Car. Tulip fights for her right to make her own choices. This season finale has a lot going on. 1-1 pretty much just says what Mesa said back in episode 8, that MT is a denizen and denizens are just meant to help passengers. This coming from the conductor of the train really confirms that Mace was right, and that MT shouldn't be allowed off the train. Jesse coming back doesn't make too much sense, but I'm glad that they bring him back early in the episode and don't try to save him for an end of book reveal. I will have to say that the paradox of denizens can't get off the train, The train must solve Jesse's problem. Jesse's problem is getting MT off the train. MT is a denizen, is clever, and 1-1 breaking down after hearing it is pretty comical. While seeing Jesse's tape was neat and all, seeing his original tape would have been nice. Tulip's tape was my favorite episode of book 1, so I'm sure they could have done something neat with it. Moving on to Steve, his reveal and sudden disregard for protocol is a really great moment for his character. While his fight with MT was short, it was still pretty decent. The solution to the problem being that MT can reflect his number was kind of anticlimactic, but I really can't think of a better way to resolve the problem. Steve's death probably includes the best animation of the show, though. I'm glad that AD was finally useful, and his goodbye flying out of the car was really the only way he could have ever left. The end scene with Lake choosing her new name was really a nice way to end the season in Lake's journey. The whole episode in general was a fantastic goodbye to these characters and a perfect ending to Lake's thematic journey, more of which I'll get to in my end of season review. Speaking of end of season review, with all 10 episodes out of the way, here it is. To get some really quick stuff out of the way, the music is still really good, the show looks slightly better than last time, but still nothing too special, and designs of the cars are only getting better and are still one of my favorite parts of the series. Finally, the humor in this season I find to be a lot more subtle, with AD doing wacky stuff in the background all the time, but it still has its great bits. With that out of the way, let's get into the meat of the season. First, the characters. Before getting into our main characters, the cat and 1-1 are the only recurring characters from last book who have more than a few lines this time around. The cat was her usual con self, nothing really too interesting with her. I hope that they expand on her character more in book 3. 1-1 on the other hand is in a few episodes and continues to be a wacky robot. He's not terribly interesting in general, but they use him relatively well. Now to the main cast. Simon, Grace, and the rest of the Apex are incredibly interesting, and I'm glad they seem to be a focal point for book 3. Steve and Mace are incredible villains and are much more recurring and prevalent than any villain was in the last book. Steve is a good cop who turns murderous after the death of Mace. Mace is a bit more interesting. His monologue in the Wasteland was one of the best moments of the series. Their deaths were satisfying and proves that nobody is safe in book 3. I don't have much to say about Alan Dracula. AD was mainly just a random joke character, and while this sounds bad, it leaves a lot more time for the main two characters. Speaking of which, Jesse's more chill attitude, hiding his own fears of disappointing people, and his willingness to please others being a detriment is a side theme for the book. He's a pretty good character, and his transition into doing what he wants to do is pretty realistic. Not nearly as bad as Tulip's was last book. MT, or Lake, is the protagonist of this season and is incredibly well written. The writer's willingness to show her kill and destroy is shocking and makes her one of the most dynamic characters in modern animation. Her and Jesse bounce off each other extremely well as she slowly becomes her own person. Jesse and Lake's relationship takes over entire scenes at times, and it's well deserved. This season is a bit more action-based than mystery, but the apex in the last 2 episodes add a little bit of mystery towards the end. I really enjoyed this show's willingness to get dark and appreciate CN for letting them do so. Averaging the scores, you get an 8 out of 10 just like the last book. I will say I did enjoy this book a little bit more though the second and third episodes really hurt the score. Finally, I won't dwell on them long, but my favorite episode was the Wasteland and my least favorite was the map car. That's all I have to say. This has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in the next season.